Welcome to LeCorner, La Source's digital show dedicated to the sport and entertainment industry. Every 2 weeks, we invite a professional to share their experience, background, and challenges. The sport industry moves fast, and having their insights is the best way to keep up to speed. Welcome to LeCorner.
Hello everyone and welcome to the 25th episode of LeCorner. Once again, we had the opportunity to discuss with a high-profile expert from the industry as we welcome one of the leading voices in international tennis in the field of sports science and coaching, Machar Reid. Machar has a PhD in biomechanics and has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and books. But as any athlete, Machar cannot cope with status quo and needs to progress all the time. And this is where comes innovation, as he is currently the head of innovation at Tennis Australia, but also general partner at WildCard Venture. During this episode, we've been through his activities within both organizations to try to understand how the innovation process is handled in these two roles. We really hope you will enjoy the show and stay tuned for more insight into the sports tech industry. Hi, Machar. How are you doing?
Good, JB. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to chat.
Yeah, Machar is based down under, so you might hear a bit of the Aussie accent, which I love. So just like I was saying, Machar, your quick intro, you're head of innovation at Tennis Australia, but you're also general partner at WildCard Ventures that you will tell us more about. But we have the habits when we start the podcast to learn more about the person, the guest we have with us. So could you introduce yourself to our audience, share a bit who you are and where you come from?
Yeah, sure. So anyway, I was born in Europe, but I've adopted an Australian accent, as JB mentioned, but born in Scotland, but spent my life for the most part in Australia, albeit there was 4 years there where I went back to Spain to live. But in a professional sense anyway, I've spent my career in sport, primarily in tennis for the last 2 decades in a variety of different capacities. First and foremost as a coach. So that was working with the world's best junior athletes as well as some professional players on the tour. So that was a great experience. The professional players were fantastic to deal with and so on. So I really enjoyed that. But at the same time,
were you a coach? Were you a coach with the players? Yeah. So okay.
Yeah, I guess I was a coach and physical trainer, so I was kind of a jack of all trades. But equally, I wasn't from the same playing credentials as many others, so I always knew that I needed to try and have to differentiate myself. So, as part of that coaching trajectory, I really wanted to specialise in technique and technology. So ended up pursuing a PhD at University of Western Australia with a guy called Bruce Elliott back in the day. So he was one of the more identifiable figures in biomechanics at the time, but technology. It was the beginnings in a sports sense of coding and beginning to use different coding languages and modelling human performance in different ways. So it was a cool time.
When was that?
2003, I think I started. So
early 2000.
Almost 20 years ago now. So mocap was beginning to establish a real presence in the market, and more work was done in 3-dimensional spaces. So it was really cool to, in retrospect, look back and go, I was part of that at an opportune time. So went down that route, coach into scientist, and then went and sought out a job with Tennis Australia, having been involved with the International Tennis Federation for a bunch of time. So within Tennis Australia, I've been lucky enough to work in the high-performance worlds, in leadership roles, and then more latterly in the innovation space, which is wild and woolly and wonderful. So,
which is an amazing world. PhD, like back in the days, I guess you must have been a decent player. I guess you had like an ATP ranking or something like that. Not really?
No, nothing, mate. National junior level, and that was it. That was kind of, my career peaked really early and then went down even quicker. So,
okay. But you must have something else to be like kind of a coach or a personal physical trainer for players in terms of like prep or mental, I don't know what's it, preparation or.
I guess I've been a real student of the game. Obviously, love sport, love tennis in particular, and as you know, in most of sport, really, you've kind of transitioned out of this world of it being an art form in terms of its instruction into it becoming progressively more scientific. So maybe I was at the beginning of that journey. I didn't hang around for a great deal of time, but the time that I was involved in the professional context, I really enjoyed, and likewise with the ITF in the junior space, it was fantastic.
And while you were like a PhD, like with all the biomechanics and all the high performance study you were doing, also you were saying modeling 3D or kind of the start of coding and sports performance with, I guess, event data and all the new data that we started to collect back in the days. Were you as well on the tour? I mean, were you as well helping? Were you at Tennis Australia already at the time to help on the high performance, or were you still traveling around and helping different players at the same time, or were you very much focused on the PhD only?
No, look, in the early 2000s, I was combining. I was based out of Spain, working with the International Tennis Federation, a guy called Miguel Crespo, broadly in the world of coach education, performance. So I was lucky enough for the ITF to allow me to do that work, which involved travelling with junior teams. There's a bunch of names there that people would be familiar with that went through that kind of funding pathway with the ITF, as well as working on the tour with professional players at the time. And then when that kind of came to its natural end, when I wanted to spend more time studying and so forth, I was able to continue to consult to different groups around the world with federations and players in mind. So it was great.
It's an amazing position. I mean, I've rarely heard about PhD or people on the scientific or research side being that much on the, I would say, practice or kind of on the field and having directly access to gold mine data or gold mine information that you can collect for the research that you were pursuing and stuff. That's a unique position, actually.
I guess I always came from the practical side to the scientific. I didn't go the other way, which may be the more typical or trodden path, start in science and try and make your way across. I was kind of always practical first and then the science can kind of follow, noting that oftentimes the science lags practice anyway, right? But I just had an inquiring mind, wanted to know more, wanted to kind of challenge the status quo or push some boundaries. So, and that, funnily enough, that's kind of the trajectory I've been on, even in the innovation space.
Yeah, clearly it's an entrepreneur mindset that you have. And actually, I see it like telling a bit of your resume or your life to the audience. It's a bit, now you also mentor at Techstars. And when I see it, is like, that might be the next step that you've done. I mean, I wanted to ask you like what you've learned or what are the key takeaways for you to actually help different startups at your own personal level. But I guess it's a bit related to the entrepreneur mindset that you were referring to, like pushing the boundaries, not being necessarily happy with the status quo and all of that. Yeah,
that's right. It's a kind of personally or selfishly kind of a match made in heaven in some respects. If I'm not able to work with the world's best athletes or coaches or not doing that anymore, if I can work with the world's best founders or aspiring to be that, couldn't wish for any more. So I love tech. I love the idea or the spirit around trying to pursue something new and better. And then I love working with people, and generally founding teams or startups are just that. They're a combination of some really brilliant minds trying to come together with sole focus of making what they do really special.
Yeah, I agree with you. And especially in the early stage, I mean, it's very much about, it's not even necessarily a product, but it becomes a product or service quite quickly. But clearly it's a team, and it's a journey with brightest mind trying to solve one pain point. So clearly understood. You've mentioned, like, today, after many years at Tennis Australia, you're now in charge of innovation. Can you tell us what it means exactly? I mean, innovation is I mean, we know that innovation can have like many definitions and is perceived very differently from maybe one organization to another, and even to one individual to another. But what are the missions, the responsibilities, and what it is for Tennis Australia?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Like we probably had those types of conversations back in your time with UEFA and what you were doing there. So it means different things to different people, different things to different organisations. So with our DNA, so that's the tennis and event DNA in mind, just because one person has that in their title, take me out of the equation, could be anyone, doesn't mean they're the custodian of all things innovative within the business. So day to day, everyone within our business is charged with the opportunity and or responsibility to innovate a process, innovate an experience, you name it. So elicit a change that adds real value. Otherwise, it could be intangible or tangible, ideally tangible, to just that, to what they're doing in their functional roles day to day. And then there's another part which, in the world of horizon kind of and thinking, if you like, that's kind of a more medium term, where you're planning with perhaps the next business cycle and or financial year in mind, where you're trying to go about, again, innovating a process, experience, you name it. And then ultimately or lastly, there's something that's more into the distance, which might be higher risk and more uncertain. And I guess my team's fortunate enough to be in a position whereby we're able to make some of those bets and or opportunities come to life, where it's like, okay, we're seeing this trend emerge in the market. We think this will be an opportunity into the future. How do we position the business in a way whereby it can benefit from it? And those that participate in our business, be it the fans at home, fans that come to our events, or the players themselves, expect some value.
Okay, so you have both the kind of horizon 5 to 10 years in terms of future trends, understanding or anticipating the future, and having the opportunity to bet on some of these trends to leverage those. And you have the kind of short term, like how do we improve processes or whatever we're delivering on a daily basis. Is that you and your team? Okay.
Sometimes they're not mutually exclusive. So they can go hand in hand, and clearly they've got a relationship with one another. But in answer to your question, my team's more focused into the future. It's got more of a futures focus. Notwithstanding that, when you look ahead, some of that can carry over into the day-to-day. And likewise,
do you have an example on that? Would you have like some kind of a use case, like potentially something your team have like highlighted? I don't need for necessarily something confidential, but something that you were like, okay, that's something more for 2025 or the AO in 2030. And actually the team on the ground came, or with the ops or whomever that was within the department, came to you and said, oh, but that's of interest. Can we try to plug that in, or can we try to do what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think there's countless. So one that immediately springs to mind is our most recent investment through WildCard Ventures, if you like, which was, and this almost applies to every investment we've made through that channel, but whereby we've identified an opportunity that can become relevant today. So the most recent one was in a group called Samsara that are developing an enzyme in the infinite plastic recycling space, which is all about trying to repurpose single-use plastics. So that's a real environmental challenge for us as a business. Okay, the enzyme isn't in production today. It will be in time, but the challenge exists for us now. So the business unit, the sustainability business unit that's responsible for it, they go, fantastic, let's try and partner up with these guys now with a view to building out how they can benefit us, not just, tomorrow, because we've got an exchange of information going on and we're in a better place to make some good decisions, but next month, next year, and hopefully in 5 years' time.
Okay, clear. And recently, the AO was quite famous for the, in all the big buzzwords around Web3 or Metaverse and NFTs that everybody's talking about. So, yeah. I was just wondering how was that the same trajectory? Meaning, is it something you were already looking at like over the past months, and that's something where you said, okay, we have an opportunity window, and the team took that or seized the opportunity in 2022 early January, or was it more something where it came because it was part of the business process naturally, or were you involved to a certain extent, or not really?
Yeah, so I think what we've been doing there is, I think like most of the sports world, that followed the early lead of the NBA and paying attention to what had been done there. And then that triggers a conversation internally. And we had a project lead guy called Ridley Plummer, who's really passionate about the space, but had the advocacy and support of our CEO, our next level of management, Darren Pierce, who heads up the media arm. So the collective comes together and goes, in spirit and in concept, we believe we've got some assets that would really lend itself to this kind of application. So you get agreement there, and then it turns to, with the Australian Open in mind, how can we best leverage our IP or the opportunity to make something really pop? And ideally, in that marketplace, it's going to be different and novel so that it captures the hearts and minds of the participants. So with that creative kind of endeavor, it's then a matter of engaging in the conversation with the suppliers in the space. So in our sense, that was Run It Wild at the time. And then you're having this conversation around, okay, here are our potential opportunities. How could we package that up in a way that's really going to land well in market?
And I think that might be one of the best, use cases we've seen in sporting.
One of the best.
One of the best.
One of the best.
Yeah. No, seriously, in terms of coming with because NFTs, like, there's a gold rush with many IPs or many sports properties. Like, the idea is to say, like, okay, that's a cash machine, and let's go there and let's release, and we will sell for 100 or 150, and we'll make thousands of those, and so we'll make big checks or whatever that is. But I think the design and what you had behind it, and even recently with the Liverpool case with a cap price and everything, that this is where the kind of utility and what you were referring to, like, how does it fit with the community we're trying to reach? And I think for me, with the AO, was one of the well executed in terms of design, storytelling also around it. Like, you had the courts being like sliced into different boxes, and that's very creative, and I think that was a nice way of delivering it. And one point you mentioned that I would like to hear you on is, you said there was someone internally, and sorry for this person, I forgot the name, that was Ridley. Ridley. But you mentioned right after that he had the buy-in from the top management, from the CEO.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the number one rule, I guess, or key success factors for any kind of innovation or projects. How do you feel that has evolved a bit? Maybe, I don't know if it's in Tennis Australia or more largely in sports or related to innovation initiatives, but the buy-in from the CEO, maybe like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, how have you seen that evolving in terms of change or understanding of it?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of factors at play, right? So our CEO in particular, Craig Tiley, I think DNA kind of pulses through his veins, right? So that's his kind of starting point, and he wants to make a difference and challenge the status quo. So you've got that on the one hand, and you've got a large number of the team that probably think in many respects the same way. And then you've got be it our geography or the event itself, which for the best part of 100 years was considered the fourth Grand Slam. So you've almost got this underdog mentality where it's like, holy heck, if we're going to be different, if we're going to compete, we need to do stuff differently, and we need to bring value to the table that looks a little bit different than other properties do. So you've kind of got that fusion of perspectives, which presents us with a really unique opportunity that allows us to have a go at the very thing that you've just described in and around the NFT project for this year.
Yeah, I see that. And just going more broadly and maybe living, and I'm going back a bit to your early days, PhD and sports performance, but if we're leaving tennis aside a little bit, and how do you see technology help address issues in injury prevention, but not only injury prevention, I'm thinking also like the best preparation for the athlete?
Yeah. No.
Big questions.
Yeah, look, dealing with the injury one first up, I reckon 20 years on, we've made some incremental progress as a sector, and it's just been that. It's certainly not been exponential. We know a bunch more than we did back then, but in terms of a great handle on how all of the risk factors with injury interact to help us predict injury or forecast injury in a reliable way and therefore prevent it, I reckon we've not made the progress there that we have in some of the other maybe verticals. So that's going to be an ongoing challenge. And across all of sport, it's so complex, right, for the most part, because most injuries, particularly in the sport of tennis, are multifactorial in kind of nature. So it's not as simple as A plus B equals C. So that's going to, and it's different across each individual. So science has made some attempts, but we've certainly not cracked the code there. And then on the performance side, again, with the introduction of technology in particular, so even with the likes of GPS or even inertial sensors more recently, computer vision beginning to head that way as well, I think what it's allowed us to do is become more specific with some of our prescription as we've tried to get our heads around this concept of load and how to best plan for, peak performance, if you like.
Okay. So being more precise on the insights you get. So being more precise to give more feedback or detailed or comprehensive information to the athletes, him or herself.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think we've got more data points available, right? So with that, you've got more information at your fingertips to hopefully dissect it in a way whereby you're able to make some more informed decisions. I think there remains a few notable gaps. One, certainly in the sport of tennis, is on the training side. So much of the attention is applied to, match day, so to speak, yet comparatively less is applied to the training setting. So getting maximum bang for your buck in and around the time that you invest on court or on pitch, I think is a real challenge for all of sport. And then the second one, that a little bit like the injury space, it is difficult to progress as we might like, is in the psychological realm. We've made some inroads, but at times it feels like it's one step forward, two back in and around unpacking how we can maximize, the cognitive elements of performance, if you like, or emotive elements of performance.
And from your own perspective, because you've been there for more than 2 decades and you've been working with athletes as well, is like, how the adoption, have you seen a change as well in the adoption from the athlete standpoint? I mean, from the tennis players or from other athletes? Is it something like where the new generation is coming at you with a wearable or whatever that is, an iPhone, and telling you, here are my stats, this is what I want to improve? Or Is it like kind of a pushback and still a bit more defensive approach, or have you seen a change or not necessarily?
I think it's better. I do. I'm not as defeatist as some in and around going, it's still no different than it was 15 years ago. And so I think it is better. I think there's a more progressive approach as, the current or contemporary athlete is exposed to those types of technologies as they come through, just in schooling and or life. But that said, compliance can still be a real challenge unless it's driven by the athlete. So I think a lot of the athlete management systems that have tried to embed and deliver a lot of that intelligence to sports organisations have suffered from that at times. Not the management system itself, but just the insight that practitioners are trying to extract from those systems can be encompassed by compliance on the athlete side. So, but I do think we're in a much better space than we were even 10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. And on one of the points you've mentioned, and I think coming from UEFA and potentially sports organizations, also making the laws of the game or putting together some rules and guidelines for some of the competitions, I was just thinking, like, you were referring to the idea of having, the athletes being able to collect more of the data or being more savvy, not just on the match day, but on all the prep and all the training and all of that. If I'm thinking, like, if I'm playing the devil's advocate and I'm thinking maybe the top 10 or top 20 can really afford to have technology to actually collect the data and best prep during this off competition time and all of that, is it, in terms of equity and competitive balance and all of that, is there something in question for not just tennis, but at large in terms of, like, would you see like a competitive advantage for maybe the more wealthy or for them that can understand and acquire these kind of insights from the technology and the data points, not just on match day where it can be provided to all players or to all athletes or to all teams, but also on non-match day with certain specialists or people around your team and staff?
Yeah, without speaking to tennis specifically, I think that challenge holds across all of sport and has done over time, right? Be it in relation to access to expert coaching or the best coaching historically or the best equipment. Those nations, teams or individuals that have had the resources to be able to tap into that historically have been at an advantage. And the same would hold today in and around access to data and or extracting meaning from it. So I don't have the answer to that. I'm not sure there is an answer to it. Obviously, there's some sports around the world, team sports in particular, that have tried to introduce caps on spending with a view to making the game
more even,
more comparable or even equitable, call it what you will. And there's some individual sports that have equally tried to introduce some regulations to limit the advantage that can be extracted from innovation that is only possible within a few groups based on, their financial resources that they have available to them.
I know it was a hard and a tough questions, but I was just wondering whether you would see that gap widening. I mean, my own perspective, being quite transparent here, I feel like potentially compared to the equipment or what used to be in the past, the impact or the insights or what you can get from the technology in terms of maximizing one potential or team potential is way bigger than what used to be in the past. And so to a certain extent, the risk of seeing that gap widening between those that can afford it and those that cannot or are not investing into it is just widening. And we've seen it, maybe in the economy in terms of look at the industries or the companies that have been investing heavily in the technology that were key drivers for growth in the past years and for the next decades. I guess they are in a way better situation today than the others that either failed or are lagging behind today. So, and I see the same trend for sports. So That's why I was referring to that.
Yeah, no, I could. I think if you hold everything else equal, so everything else remains constant, and it's just leveraging data, I reckon what you're describing absolutely holds in a sports context. But in an individual sport like tennis, where so much of it is played between the ears, as distinct from your technical or tactical or physical skill, you've got such a you could mount a case that you get pretty quickly to a point of diminishing returns in trying to extract meaning from data. And that's coming from a person that genuinely believes in the value of data. But I don't think you can discount it based on the personal and mental qualities that an athlete needs to bring to the table.
Clearly, it's just an add-on for the 1 or 2% maximization that you're trying to acquire, not all the rest where talent is still key. I mean, with all the data I can have, I will still be shit playing tennis. So that's understandable.
It's in the eye of the beholder, but I'll take your word for
it. Before we move on to WildCard Ventures, because you referred to it, and I really want to touch on this because I think it's quite innovative as well in the space of sport. From a sports organization or an IP owner. I wanted to have a bit of your vision on what would be your 3 favorite technologies for those that you see a great future for. You mentioned kind of your business is also meant to focus on what's coming next, a bit horizon 5-10 years. What are the 3 favorite technologies you're looking at today for which you see like the biggest impact? Crystal ball.
Well, I kind of would immediately play into those that we've invested in, right? So, but at the risk of it being an advertisement for what WildCard does, maybe I can.
No, it's okay.
No, I was going to say I can answer it. If I was to rewind the clock and look forward, I reckon comment on some of the most wonderful technologies that the world of sport's kind of seen over the last, call it somewhere between 5 and 15 years. And I was going to say the 3 that really jump off the page to me for different reasons. One's home court. So what the guys out of the US have done in the basketball space in terms of activating, using a technology to activate and connect with an adolescent group and allow them to interact with technology in a way that's really engaging and has the potential to develop skill. I don't think it had been done at that scale before. So I love that. I loved what Catapult did, which was an Australian business, in terms of normalizing the data conversation in professional sport. So I just loved it. Just thought that, and that had been a long time in the making. But now people professional sports athletes don't think twice. Tennis is a little bit different, but certainly the team sports don't think twice about sensor, right? It's just so they've completely changed the paradigm in pro sport, or led the way in doing it. And then the third one, ironically enough, is a little closer to home in Hawkeye. And these guys, both from an officiating point of view as a starting point, but equally broadcast, they were real trailblazers, and they've paved the way for a bunch of others to try and come into market and add additional value. So in the rear view, they're the ones that really jump off the page for me when I think about, 3 of my favorite kind of technologies in the world of sport and entertainment. I just go, wow, what those groups have done. It's kind of game-changing, and we kind of use that term loosely, but it genuinely is. It's been transformative.
Okay. And then we can speak about the investment in WildCard Venture, because I think it's still very much relevant for the audience, and I would like to discuss about that. Yep. But before we jump into it, home court, I love it as well. I mean, I'm not Catapult, Okai. We know them well as well, and I also agree with what you just said, but home court to a certain extent, and now their moves from purely the sports performance or the elite pathway with younger generations or the academy side of things to now a bit more of the grassroots and let's say, the vast majority of citizens that want to play sports and trying to have this kind of digital or kind of like pushing kids or anybody to play the sports a bit more. Is it something that you're looking at from your perspective within the AO, or are you trying to work with the ITF on that in terms of like pushing the boundaries for having more and more tennis players at amateur grassroots level everywhere in the world, and especially in Australia?
Yeah, so it's a great segue into, I guess, the first investment we made with WildCard Ventures was in a group called Swing Vision, which was out of the Silicon Valley in the States, a group of computer scientists coming together with a view to almost pulling together two of those favorite technologies that I just mentioned, almost the use case of Hawkeye and the use case of home court coming together in a way that would allow recreational tennis players or kids around the world to use technology, engage with it, and make the playing experience pop in a way that our sport hasn't previously. So in answer to your question, yeah, we're continuing to collaborate with that group because, one, we're invested in it and we want to see them do really well, but we genuinely believe in their mission and want to be part of
their mission. Okay. So I was not meant to do that transition that perfectly, that's a good one, actually. I should give me credit for that one.
For future reference,
yeah. But maybe before, because I wanted to see the portfolio and how do you guys invest, and so that even the startup community we engage with usually, or our audience, can understand it better. But can you present briefly WildCard Ventures? What do you do? Potentially the Accelerator partnership you have with Techstars as well at the same time, and what's in it for the startups and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. So at Tennis Australia, anyway, we've got three distinct parts to what we do. The biggest part of our portfolio is the Australian Open and our events footprint. So, as we discussed a moment ago, Australian Open, Grand Slam, it's the biggest, most heavily attended annual sports event in the Southern Hemisphere. And it obviously starts, it kicks off in January at the start of the year. So most of the eyes of the world are on us from a sporting perspective, which is fantastic. And then we're able to generate a large revenue base out of that event and the accompanying events in the lead up to the AO, as well as, the startup that we kind of launched years back, which was the Laver Cup, which is the equivalent of Ryder Cup, but for tennis. So we've got that event footprint that creates revenue base that we're then able to reinvest in the sport, both in the performance pathway. So let's produce, the next Ash Barty. And that's more relevant now than ever before, given Ash's decision recently. But so next Ash Barty, the next Grand Slam champion, the next world number one. So we actively support that endeavour. And then equally, we try and grow the sport of tennis throughout our communities. So we've got 3,000 clubs, just as many coaches, X thousand worth of courts around the country that all belong and that we try and serve as part of a federation. So we've kind of got those three opportunities: event, the community sport piece, and then we've got the performance angle. So with that in mind, we're genuinely pursuing, like I mentioned some time ago, part of our DNA, to pursue opportunities to challenge the status quo and to innovate, to adopt technology really quickly. So with that in mind, we essentially get a bunch of inbound inquiry, and we're also in market actively to try and identify opportunities to disrupt, as I mentioned.
Okay.
So as part of that, in looking at it from a client point of view, could we adopt these technologies with a view to making experiences better now or into the future? We've also turned our attention to, well, hang on, we actually want to double down and support these founders or teams in more accelerated fashion. So let's not just be a client potentially, let's also try and invest. So
So it's to be more of a partner. And so for me to try to understand it, because you mentioned you have so many inbound, so I guess your team is doing some kind of a filtering, while at the same time, based on the pain points you have identified internally, you are screening the market for new solutions to help you. But
yep.
The investment, I guess, is not automatic. There's a pre-phase where potentially you are tasting or you are using the event or what you were referring to in terms of like you have a specific phase, or is there some kind of a formal process you have, or is it more on a case-by-case basis depending on the product and the service you're looking for?
Yeah, sure. So so I guess, and I should clarify, we're not operating as a corporate VC. That's very clear to us. We're not investing directly off the balance sheet or anything like that. This is us trying to invest with a view to delivering financial return. But in delivering the financial return to ourselves and the LPs, the best way for us to help ensure that is to springboard the technology through the assets that we kind of have. So they almost go hand in hand. Our best way of offering up value to the startup is to ensure that we can inject them into our ecosystems or opportunities. And in turn, we'd hope that would grow value in the business and equally grow value for our partners in the fund. So, but in answer to your question, in terms of the due diligence process, if you like, yep, there's a screening process that myself and Todd Deacon, the other GP in WildCard, is involved in. So that's obviously extensive to pass through that first gate. And then it's a matter of taking that to our venture advisory group. They become a bit of a sounding board for us, given their expertise and experience in the field, and then ultimately to the investment committee.
Okay. And once they have passed these gates, it's like you provide them with some kind of a, I guess, both technical or expertise from your own staff, like depending on the business units involved internally, but also some kind of a test case. I mean, I don't know if you're running also other events, maybe less, I would say, risky than the AO in terms of trying something out directly, but how does that work?
It depends on the business a little bit. So
yeah,
some of the digital technologies can kind of plug into some of our assets online, relatively smoothly and directly. The likes of Swing Vision that I mentioned a moment ago, that doesn't necessarily need the springboard of AO. It's got a different market or audience in mind. So that conversation becomes very, case by case. There's no one size fits all approach there.
Yeah, okay. And is there, like, in terms of investment, I guess that's the same process. Do you have like some kind of a thesis, or do you have like a minimum or maximum investment, or do you have specific conditions or not necessarily?
Yeah, so I think initially when we launched, we were kind of positioned in a way where it was we were thinking about check sizes classically in your seed to Series A kind of stage. But increasingly, we've probably accepted that as opportunities come, especially those inbound, we've got the flex to be a bit more agnostic for stage. So then the check size just needs to scale up accordingly. So you mentioned a moment early on, mate, that in terms of deal flow, one of our most active and opportune ways of accessing deal flow is through our accelerator with Techstars. So for those that aren't familiar, Techstars is obviously one of the world's biggest corporate accelerator groups. We partnered with them a couple of years ago alongside the Victorian government and Victoria University. And that program, literally, our second accelerator, kicked off just last week. So we've got 10, in a more traditional sense, probably seed stage businesses that are participating in that accelerator. We interact with them in different ways, both as mentors, but equally with the potential to run proof of concepts or pilots that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. So, and then ultimately, because we've got 12 to 13 weeks to in essence, get a sense for what makes them tick and what opportunity lies ahead, it's a great way of making decisions for WildCard also.
Yeah, it's a bit kind of a testing playground for you and see if there is a market fit or if there is something, and then potentially at the end of this kind of a 12, 13 weeks program, you can see whether that is smart to make an investment.
Yeah, and Techstars was our first active move into the venture space. That was our first deliberate step, which is like, okay, let's connect with a really reputable group internationally and let's get involved in the market. Let's get involved in the ecosystem and begin to grow our own networks, our own collaborations. Heck, that might have even been where you and I connected through that kind of broader network. So that's been really valuable in growing deal flow more broadly.
And a quick one on that is like, you're based in Australia. How do you perceive maybe the difference or the similarity between the sports tech down under compared to Europe or even North America?
I reckon any data points tell us the same thing, right? Which is the industry in Australia is smaller than both of those markets, which is where our fund needs to be international in focus. So it's not like other groups that have got a real domestic or Australia, New Zealand lens. We're looking for opportunities that come to us internationally where we can make their technology run more quickly globally, but equally within our borders or within the region.
And maybe one of the last questions I have, and it's like I'm seeing this trend. I mean, we've been seeing it for quite some times now, but players, athletes are becoming more and more important. They are becoming more and more savvy as well in terms of investment. They are becoming their own brands, not just on social and everything, but maybe the NBA players have been leading the way, that's for sure, and they paved the way, and we see it now in football and many other sports. How do you see that for tennis? Is it something where, we've seen Roger obviously investing and a few other ones as well following up.
You've seen it with
different
startups. Serena's got her own fund. Andy Murray's pretty active in the space. So,
Is there a strategy for you to be closer to the professional tennis player, maybe in Australia as well, or is it not necessarily something you're thinking of? Or
so no, the fund is open because it's a syndicate model whereby we identify these opportunities and then present them to our syndicate, and it's a confidential syndicate. They can opt into deals on a deal by deal basis as they might like. So the professional playing cohort is absolutely welcome to join the syndicate, and some have, which is great. So, and it's up to them. It's on them as to whether they want to use their IP and or brand to springboard the startup to higher heights. We won't be doing that. That's a decision that the individual athlete needs to make.
Yeah, that's their own decision and own case, but they could be part of it and they could be leveraging it, which would be good as well for WildCard Ventures and the AO, I guess.
Absolutely.
Well.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's got to be a decision that the individual's comfortable with.
Okay. Last questions, maybe as well, maybe crystal ball, quite a difficult one, but I wanted to ask it from your WildCard Venture perspective is where do you see, to a certain extent, I don't know if it's a sector or a specific vertical, is where you've seen the most innovative or the high potential solutions to engage with? Is there a specific vertical or specific space or some ideas or some even tech or product you've seen recently that you were like, okay, that's something to be looking at?
I think, the whole meta, so the Metaverse, Web 3.0, NFTs is going to be one that we have to watch. And we're all part of that trajectory over the next kind of decade. So that's not going away. That'll, in different forms, continue to present as an opportunity. More broadly in the media and kind of broadcast space, that's a tricky market to enter, but really lucrative if you can. So in a way, it's ripe for innovation, but the barriers for entry are quite high.
It's high.
And then thirdly, in the world of betting and integrity, with a window of 3 to 5 years in mind, I reckon there's a real opportunity there for some clever groups approaching different problems in unique ways to maximise and leverage their IP. So that's a thematic that we're following closely.
Okay, clear. Maybe a last question for our audience, or anything we'd like to finish and to wrap up. If you have any recommendation, I don't know, a book, a series, or something you've been watching when you were a kid or recently, or whatever that is, any kind of, or even a podcast or whatever that can be.
Yeah, you know what? There's a podcast. And for those that are interested in innovation and kind of David and Goliath battles, I love what Business Wars have done. And that's not a new podcast. It's been going for 3 years, but it's a great listen. The way that it's presented by the narrator, I really enjoy. It's informative but not heavy at the same time. And it's a fascinating insight into the way that an industry can be disrupted. So anyone that hasn't tuned in, I recommend that for sure.
Okay, cool, Machar. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the insights and for sharing the AO and the WildCard Venture perspective. That was really cool. And talk to you soon, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, man. See ya.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoy it as much as we love creating them. If you like the episode, feel free to comment, rate, and share with people around you. You can visit our website, www.lastsource.io, to learn more about our activities. You will discover a wide range of articles and can subscribe to our newsletter to receive the latest tech and sports news in your mailbox every month. Stay tuned for new episodes.
Le Corner.